shady journalism.
It's not shady journalism. Did I think it was going to get views? Of course. That's why we interview certain people. That's why you brought Dr. Umar here, right? Because you thought it'd get views. You didn't bring him because you didn't think it was going to get. You didn't do it to educate the public on the African-centered perspective. You did it because you thought it clicks. And that's the same.
In closing, you're not being sued.
No, I'm not being sued.
Oh, story ain't fun no more now.
I am not being sued. You want me to be sued?
I'll tell you when your man gets sued. That's crazy.
It's not funny when your man gets sued. It's not funny when your man gets sued.
Let Brian hit me.
You got him?
Yeah.
Cool, because if I get sued for my comments here, I have to say that I was pushed to do this at the behest of my boss.
Marc Lamont Hill and Joe went head-to-head, but honestly, it wasn't just those two going at it. Everyone on the panel was taking shots at each other throughout the entire episode. So what exactly was going on in that studio? Because this wasn't your typical back-and-forth debate. This was constant sniping, clashing, and tension that never let up. And I wouldn't even call it passive-aggressive. This was full-on aggressive. So we're going to walk through everything, break it all down, and make sense of what actually went down. And look, this episode was genuinely great to watch. It was entertaining from start to finish, and a huge part of that was the friction between the co-hosts. Now, the first major moment I want to highlight is the exchange between Joe and Marc around Dr. Umar Johnson and the lawsuit involving Marc Lamont Hill and Brian McKnight. Here's where it gets interesting. Marc brought up Dr. Umar directly in response to Joe, because Joe was essentially implying that Marc was being clout-driven for interviewing Brian McKnight in the first place. Marc pushed back and said, hold on, you all brought up the subject. And from there, he chose to dig deeper by interviewing Brian McKnight's son and his estranged wife on his Patreon. But then Marc flipped it and said, what about you, Joe? When you sat down with Dr. Umar, that wasn't for some noble, community-driven reason. That was for the clicks and the views, just like everyone else. Joe's reaction said everything. He gave this look like he couldn't believe what he just heard, and then he had nothing to say. He didn't fire back, he just sat with it. And if you go back and watch the video, you'll see exactly what I mean. The look on his face made it very clear he was not happy about that one. Now, as for the Brian McKnight lawsuit, I do think this is significant because depending on how it plays out, it could affect how Marc Lamont Hill approaches the podcast going forward. He was not gentle when talking about McKnight. He called him out directly, used strong language, and made his opinion very clear. The clips exist. This isn't speculation. What made things even more interesting is that Marc initially said he wasn't being sued, but looking at the actual paperwork, this was not vague or generated content. It referenced specific episodes and listed Marc Lamont Hill by name as a defendant. He later acknowledged that he hadn't fully reviewed the documents at the time, and once he did, his tone shifted. It was starting to look like this could be very real. But beyond the lawsuit, there was a whole other layer of tension happening because Joe also took a shot at Ish, suggesting that Ish had been walking on eggshells around Marc Lamont Hill ever since their flat earth debate. Marc always jumps in and saves, ever since that flat earth fight they had. Look at you trying to push a narrative on your little fan club. I know how it goes. Ever since things got tricky with words, you've been real quiet. And that right there taps into a dynamic that has been running through this show ever since Marc and Ish have been on the panel together. Because here's the thing, before Marc Lamont Hill ever showed up, Ish was essentially the guy. He was the one who felt confident debating anyone on anything. He'd hold his own, win arguments, and carry himself like someone who had done his homework. But when Marc arrived, everything shifted. Now Ish was dealing with someone who didn't just have opinions. He had research, academic background, and the ability to dismantle an argument point by point. And Ish simply isn't built that way. So every time they go at it, it would gradually expose the fact that Ish was largely operating on instinct rather than preparation. Joe and Flip both noticed that dynamic and decided to put a spotlight on it. And if you pay attention while watching the podcast now, the pattern is hard to miss. Ish will actually look over to Marc before weighing in on certain topics. And even when they do disagree, Ish will open with something like, Marc, I'm not coming at you like that. You're my guy. You know what I mean? It's a softer entry. It's not the Ish we used to see. The old Ish didn't ease into anything. He'd come straight at whoever was across from him. No warm-up, no disclaimer. But his energy with Marc Lamont Hill is noticeably different compared to how he engages with Joe or Flip. And the reason is easy to figure out. He knows that pushing too hard against Marc carries a real risk of getting exposed in front of the audience. And after what happened during the Flat Earth debate, he has no interest in going through that again. But that wasn't the only tension in the room. During this whole four-way exchange between Ish, Marc, Flip, and Joe, Marc starts taking direct shots at Flip and Joe. He referred to Flip and Joe as one and a possible, meaning Joe is the real competition and Flip is just along for the ride. And he backed it up with an analogy. He said something along the lines of, if Anton Daniels and Brian McKnight are having a conversation and both say something about me, I'm only addressing Brian McKnight. I'm not responding to the possible. Whatever, possible. It's possible that you back down. And the connection he was drawing there was to the actual situation with Anton and Brian, where Marc responded to McKnight directly, but chose not to engage with Anton at all.
Then Ish fired back at Flip and said, "You want to talk about me going quiet after the flat earth debate? How about that time you went completely silent after the tricky words situation? So don't come in here acting like you're above it." And then he called him a cheerleader, straight up. He told Flip he needed pom-poms and a pleated skirt because he was out here riding for Joe without any independent thought of his own. And honestly, there's something to that observation. Flip does tend to align with Joe more often than not. Whether that's genuine agreement or just comfort in numbers, it's hard to say. But when you're up against someone like Marc Lamont Hill on a panel, having Joe in your corner does make things considerably easier. So the strategy, whether conscious or not, makes sense. Now, this episode overall was exactly what makes this show compelling when it's firing on all cylinders. The tension was real, the exchanges had weight, there was the whole Drake internet conversation layered in on top of everything, and then even Parks got loud, and Flip got loud right back. And I'm sitting there thinking, oh, Flip's actually squaring up with Parks now too? I don't care what their opinions are. Who are they? The internet moves the needle. Sorry, but y'all are living in a fantasy. The internet moves the needle. I don't live in a fantasy. I live in the real world. This content exists on the internet. It generates serious money because of the internet. They move the needle. Enough about the internet. You can't dismiss all of these people. These are the people actually buying the product. And that exchange right there is what made this such a fascinating episode to sit through. But it also made me wonder, was something already brewing before they even hit record? Because sometimes I can't help but notice that Mona seems to miss episodes of the podcast while she's out doing things with the Black Effect Network. She recently appeared at what looked like a Black Effect Festival live podcast event. Are my cousins here? What's good? Let's get straight into it. I'm Don't Call Me White Girl from the Don't Call Me White Girl podcast, and this is my guy. And I'm sitting here thinking, it's wild that Joe is literally the one cutting checks for people on that podcast, but they're consistently the first ones on a flight to go do something with Charlemagne. Even Ish is showing up to Black Effect events. That's a telling pattern. I don't think Joe is actually okay with it. I think he plays it cool publicly, but underneath that, it probably stings watching people he employs gravitating towards Charlemagne's lane every chance they get. Now, on the media side of things, there's been talk about Sirius potentially acquiring iHeart or some kind of merger between the two. And honestly, when I looked at the article that came out of Variety, the same outlet that's run multiple pieces on Charlemagne's reported $200 million deal, it read less like journalism and more like a planted piece. The framing was heavily focused on explaining why iHeart's debt load wasn't actually as bad as it looks. That raised an eyebrow. It felt like something designed to make iHeart appear more attractive to a potential buyer rather than a straightforward news report. And look, iHeart is not in a strong position right now. They're carrying significant debt. Traditional radio is declining, and they haven't cracked the code on digital monetization the way Spotify or other streaming platforms have. My read is that they want out of the digital competition entirely because they simply can't go toe-to-toe with those platforms. So they're pivoting to partnerships. But would Sirius even want that headache? I'm skeptical. Sirius could just sign individual shows directly and put them on their own network without absorbing all of iHeart's baggage. Why take on a bloated infrastructure and a mountain of debt when you can just poach the talent? The reason this matters here is that the iHeart and Charlemagne operation is directly tied into the orbit of Joe Budden's podcast. A lot of the people connected to that show seem drawn toward iHeart opportunities. That's worth watching, because if Sirius and iHeart eventually consolidate, the ripple effects could be significant. Now, wrapping everything up, this video was really centered on Marc Lamont Hill and Joe going at it. And that Dr. Umar moment genuinely caught me off guard. I didn't see Marc pulling that card, but the look on Joe's face when it landed told you everything. And that's kind of the thing with Joe. He positions himself as being above the clicks and views game. But let's be honest, when he fired Rory and Mal the way he did, that was performance. His Patreon numbers weren't where he wanted them, and he needed a moment that would drive subscriptions. That was appointment content, deliberately created. But he'll turn around and critique other people for doing interviews or chasing engagement, the exact same things he does, just wrapped in better framing. And his band face runs that cover for him. Oh, that's different. Joe operates differently. Marc peeled that back for a moment, and it was one of the more honest exchanges the show has produced in a while. Overall, this was genuinely one of the better episodes in recent memory, not just for the tension, but for the actual substance underneath it. Let me know what you think down in the comments, and make sure you're following me on Instagram.